The desert is merciless. It burns by day, freezes by night, and offers nothing freely. But from its cruelty it forged men of steel. Among them was Geronimo, born not to comfort but to struggle. He learned to read the stars, to walk without sound, to drink life from stones. Every hardship carved him into something greater. He was not merely a child of the Apache. He was a son of the desert itself. Could you survive where even the land seems sworn against you? As a boy, Geronimo knew hunger more often than fullness. His stomach grew strong from roots and wild herbs. His body hardened under endless marches. The Apache trained their young, not in schools, but in survival. He was taught to run for days without rest, to fight with bare hands, to endure pain without a cry. The desert was both teacher and enemy, sculpting resilience no army could ever match. Strength, to the Apache, was not a gift. It was the price of survival. By the time most children still dream, Geronimo had already faced death. He saw scorpions strike, rivers flood, warriors fall. But instead of fear, he gained calm. To live in Apache lands was to live knowing that each sunrise could be your last. That knowledge did not weaken him. It set him free, because a man who accepts death cannot be broken by it. This was the foundation of Geronimo, a boy who understood that life itself was borrowed, and thus every moment was meant for courage. The desert whispered lessons others never hear. Every bird's cry, every shift of wind carried meaning. Geronimo listened. He could sense enemies before they appeared, storms before they formed. The Apache believed the land spoke to those who respected it, and to Geronimo, the desert became an ally. When others saw emptiness, he saw power. This bond would carry him through battles to come, for he was never truly alone. The earth itself moved with him. By the time Geronimo became a young warrior, he was already more than flesh and blood. He was endurance made living, patience given form. The desert had tested him, and he had not broken. That is why his people trusted him, why his enemies feared him, because the land that kills most men had chosen one to embody its spirit. And so began the story of a warrior who would one day make empires tremble. The boy of the desert was gone. In his place rose Geronimo. Geronimo was not born to hate. He was born to love his wife, his children, his people. But love, when torn away, becomes fire. One day, while Geronimo traded peacefully, Mexican soldiers raided his camp. When he returned, the earth was silent. His wife, his mother, his children slaughtered. He fell to the ground, broken, and in that silence, something inside him shattered, then hardened. Grief became fury. From that day, Geronimo lived not as a man, but as vengeance itself. He sought no comfort, no rest, no tears. He went into the mountains and prayed for strength. The spirits of his ancestors answered. He felt fire in his chest, clarity in his eyes. He was not fighting for conquest. He was fighting to carry the memory of those lost, to make sure their blood was not forgotten. The Apache believed the spirits walked with him. And Geronimo believed it too. From grief was born a warrior no bullet could stop. Each raid was more than war. It was ritual. When Geronimo struck, he carried the weight of ghosts. He became swift, merciless, a storm of arrows and steel. The soldiers who once laughed at savages began to tremble. They said bullets could not touch him. They said the earth itself shielded him. And perhaps it did. Because Geronimo no longer fought as one man, he fought as 1,000 spirits. Every life taken was not revenge, it was remembrance. He did not fight alone. Other Apache warriors, grieving their own losses, followed him. Together, they became more than fighters. They became shadows in the desert. They struck from nowhere, vanished into nothing. Each raid carried the cries of the dead. Each escape fueled the myth that Geronimo couldn't die. And in truth, how can a man die when he no longer fights for himself but for all who came before him? The world began to hear his name, Geronimo. To the soldiers it was a curse. To his people it was a prayer, a name forged in blood, carried by vengeance, and destined for legend. For when love is torn from the heart, what remains is a force more powerful than fear, more enduring than pain. Geronimo had become that force, and history would never be the same. After grief came fire. Geronimo turned sorrow into action, pain into war. Every canyon echoed with the cries of soldiers who thought themselves hunters but became prey. He struck with precision, vanishing like smoke before dawn. His enemies carried rifles and cannons, but he carried the desert itself. For the Apache, the land was weapon, shield, and spirit. And Geronimo wielded it all. The warpath had begun, and the world would soon know his name. The Apache did not fight like armies. They fought like the earth itself. Silent, sudden, merciless. Geronimo could ride for days without food, cross rivers without leaving a ripple. His warriors melted into the landscape, each shadow a blade, each whisper a warning. Soldiers who thought themselves conquerors found themselves hunted. The warpath was not battle, it was survival sharpened into steel. And in Geronimo's hands, survival became a weapon no empire could match. They said he could see in the dark, hear footsteps miles away. They said bullets curved around him as if afraid to touch his skin. Whether myth or truth, fear did half his work. An enemy who believes you cannot die has already lost. Geronimo understood this well. He cultivated the legend, fed it with each escape, each victory. By the time armies doubled their size, soldiers already trembled. They were not fighting a man, they were fighting a storm. But storms cannot be chained. The more they hunted him, the more he eluded them. His raids cut supply lines, freed captives, and reminded the world that the Apache were not broken. He did not fight for conquest. He fought for dignity, for survival, for memory. And so long as his people lived, his warpath wouldn't end. Because Geronimo's war was never about land, it was about existence, and existence is the fiercest war of all. Every raid, every escape carved his legend deeper. The world whispered his name, and with each whisper, he grew stronger. To his enemies, he was a nightmare. To his people, he was hope made flesh. The warpath carried him across deserts and mountains, across years and borders. And though armies multiplied, the outcome never changed. Because Geronimo had become more than warrior. He had become war itself. The war did not rest. Each season brought new raids, new battles, new fears. Geronimo fought with precision, but his enemies fought with cruelty. Villages burned, families were torn, and the desert ran red. To the Apache, this was not just war, it was survival. To their enemies, it was conquest. Yet the harder they pressed, the fiercer Geronimo became. Mercy was a luxury no longer possible, and so the war without mercy began. Soldiers marched with rifles and bayonets, but Geronimo moved with silence and shadow. He struck at night, vanished by dawn, leaving fear in every camp. Each battle was swift, brutal, unforgettable. He fought not to conquer, but to remind the world that the Apache were not prey. He would rather see his people perish with dignity than live on their knees. And so he gave his enemies no rest, no comfort, no peace. The cruelty of his enemies only deepened his resolve. They slaughtered indiscriminately, branding the Apache as savages. But who was savage? The one defending his home or the one burning it to ashes? Geronimo made no apologies. His fury matched their brutality. He answered fire with fire, blood with blood. This was not vengeance, it was balance. To strike terror into those who believed themselves untouchable was justice in his eyes. The Apache were fewer, but Geronimo made them seem countless. Every raid gave rise to stories. Every escape grew into legend. The soldiers could not kill what they could not catch. They grew restless, doubtful, fearful. And in fear, they made mistakes. Geronimo used every weakness, every hesitation, every shadow. He knew that fear spreads faster than bullets, and he made it his greatest weapon. The war without mercy was not only a clash of weapons, but of wills. The empires wanted submission, but Geronimo demanded respect. They sought to erase a people, but he carved their memory deeper with each battle. No treaty, no army, no bullet could erase him, because Geronimo was not fighting for victory alone. He was fighting to prove that the Apache spirit could never be silenced, and that fight would make him eternal. They called him a phantom. He appeared where least expected, struck without warning, and vanished like mist. To the Apache, he was protector. To his enemies, he was nightmare. The desert became his cloak, the mountains his fortress. Soldiers swore they saw him ride across ridges where no horse could climb, or vanish into rivers without leaving a ripple. Geronimo was no longer just a man, he was the ghost of a nation refusing to die. Every failed chase fed the myth. They said he could walk without leaving footprints. They said no bullet could pierce his skin. The truth mattered less than the fear it inspired. Armies doubted their strength, soldiers whispered prayers, and generals admitted frustration. Geronimo understood the power of legend. He did not need to win every battle. He only needed to endure long enough for fear to do his work. The phantom was not alone. His warriors shared his endurance, his cunning, his rage. They moved as one with the land, striking from shadows, vanishing into storms. Every ridge, canyon, and river became part of their strategy. Where soldiers stumbled, the Apache soared. Where armies hesitated, Geronimo struck. This was more than war. It was a game of survival played on a board only he knew. The more the armies pursued, the more they failed. Each defeat, each escape, each whisper of Geronimo only deepened the fear. He was no longer hunted, he was hunter. His enemies carried maps and compasses, but he carried memory, instinct, and spirit. The desert obeyed him, the mountains shielded him, and his people's grief gave him endless fuel. The phantom of the desert was more than a myth. He was proof that no empire, no matter how strong, could crush the will of a people who refused to kneel. Geronimo was the desert's answer to conquest, the mountain's rejection of surrender. He was the voice of the Apache, echoing through every canyon, whispering to every soldier who dared to chase him, "You will never break us." The United States and Mexico sent thousands of men. Columns of soldiers stretched across deserts, determined to end one Apache warrior. They believed numbers would crush him. But every time they thought they had Geronimo, he slipped away. Their boots blistered, their supplies ran dry, while he vanished into canyons and rivers. The more they chased, the more impossible it seemed. It was not just a pursuit, it was humiliation. Armies of nations chasing a man they could never hold. Geronimo turned the chase into a game only he knew the rules to. He doubled back on his own trails, erased tracks with branches, disappeared into storms. At times, he let the soldiers believe they had cornered him, only to strike from behind. The desert itself seemed to favor him, its silence, its dangers, its secrets. Geronimo knew them all. The soldiers were guests. He was the land's own blood. How do you defeat an enemy who vanishes into the very earth beneath your feet? The chase was costly. Months of pursuit drained armies of food, money, and morale. Generals demanded results. Soldiers wanted rest. But Geronimo gave them none. He struck caravans, freed prisoners, then vanished again. He drained their strength not with battles, but with exhaustion. For every soldier who fell to bullets, 10 more fell to despair. Empires could buy guns, but they could not buy spirit, and Geronimo's spirit was endless. Each failed chase made him larger in legend. They said he could walk without leaving footprints. They said he drank from stones, vanished into winds, commanded spirits of the desert. To his enemies, these were nightmares. To his people, they were proof. Geronimo was chosen. And so, each hunt did not weaken him. It crowned him. The more they failed, the more powerful he became. Years passed, yet the chase continued. Generals came and went, soldiers died, borders shifted. But Geronimo remained. For the empires, the war was about control. For Geronimo, it was about survival. And survival gives endless strength. Every pursuit proved one truth. Geronimo was not the hunted. He was the storm that never allowed peace. If the chase never ends, who is truly trapped, the hunted or the hunters? Decades of war took their toll. The Apache were fewer now, their families weary, their children hungry. Geronimo fought with fire, but even fire needs fuel. Armies closed in from every side, and allies grew scarce. The desert that once shielded him now echoed with footsteps of thousands. Even Geronimo knew the storm couldn't rage forever, but surrender. That was not defeat. It was only another chapter in a battle that refused to end. In 1886, the U.S. Army launched its greatest chase. 5,000 soldiers, hundreds of scouts, all for Geronimo, and fewer than 40 warriors. It was the most expensive pursuit in American history. Still, Geronimo made them sweat, bleed, and despair until the last. But the cost on his people grew too heavy, and at last he agreed to meet, not as a broken man, not as a prisoner, but as a leader who chose when the fight paused. In the desert of Arizona, Geronimo rode out to meet General Nelson Miles. He carried no chains, only dignity. The soldiers who witnessed it never forgot. This was not the face of defeat, but of defiance. He laid down his weapons, not because fear conquered him, but because wisdom guided him. He had kept his people alive. He had turned grief into legend. Surrender that day was not silence, it was thunder. They sent him east, far from his desert. Crowds came to see him, some in awe, some in fear. Even in chains his presence shook cities. He rode in parades, met presidents, and yet his eyes never bowed. To the world he was captive. To his people he remained free, because freedom is not only land, it is spirit. And Geronimo's spirit could never be bound. The newspapers called it surrender. But the Apache remembered it differently. To them, it was proof of endurance, of spirit unbroken. Geronimo did not lose. He endured. He did not vanish. He transformed. And that transformation ensured his name would outlive both empires that hunted him. Skeleton Canyon was not an ending. It was the moment a man became eternal. After his surrender, Geronimo lived far from the desert that raised him. First as a prisoner of war, then as a symbol both feared and admired. He worked the fields, spoke to crowds, and even sold his autograph. Yet beneath the surface, his heart remained restless. The desert called to him, the mountains whispered his name. He longed not for fame, but for freedom. And though his body aged, his spirit remained unbroken. In 1909, after a lifetime of battles, escapes, and survival, Geronimo's journey neared its end. He fell ill after being thrown from his horse, a warrior to the last moment. As he lay dying, he whispered regret, not for war, not for surrender, but for never seeing his homeland again. That was his only wound that never healed. Yet, even as death approached, his eyes carried defiance, because men die, but legends endure. Geronimo's body was laid to rest, but his story refused burial. The newspapers wrote of him. The soldiers remembered him, and the Apache carried his name like a sacred fire. His enemies thought death ended him, but death only set him free. Now he belonged not to one tribe or one desert, but to history itself. Legends are not buried, they rise. For the Apache, Geronimo's spirit lived in every song, every prayer, every child who carried his name. To whisper Geronimo was to remember resistance. For the Apache, Geronimo's spirit lived in every song, every prayer, every child who carried his name. To whisper Geronimo was to remember resistance. To tell his story was to defy silence. Even his enemies, in fear or respect, kept his legend alive. Geronimo proved one truth: men may fall, but the spirit of a people endures. Death did not silence him. It made him eternal. From boy of the desert to warrior of vengeance to phantom of empires. Geronimo's life was not one story, but many. He lost everything, yet carried memory into every battle. He defied 2 nations, and though he laid down his arms, he was never broken. His name survives not because of treaties, but because he refused to vanish. Greatness is not measured by what you conquer, but by what refuses to die within you. Geronimo's legacy did not end in 1909. It continues in every Apache who walks the desert, in every fighter who refuses to kneel, in every voice that dares to speak truth against power. Even his enemies carry his memory, in stories, in whispers, in fear that turned into respect. Legends do not die when men do. They die only when we stop telling them. And Geronimo's story still burns. Today, his name is shouted by soldiers leaping into battle, by children daring to dream, by storytellers keeping fire alive. To cry Geronimo is to summon courage, to claim defiance, to remember a man who refused surrender. His story belongs not only to the Apache, but to all who resist erasure. For as long as the world values freedom, Geronimo will ride again, in spirit, in legend, in memory. This is why Geronimo is more than history. He is question, challenge, and mirror. He forces us to ask, what do we stand for? What will we endure? What part of us refuses to vanish, no matter the weight of empire? Legends live not in books, but in the choices we make. Geronimo's legend is not finished, because it lives in you.